He studied philosophy and journalism at London and Westminster University before receiving a Ph.D. in intercultural philosophy from the University of Hildesheim. He wrote his dissertation about the modern philosophical receptions of the Bhagavad Gītā in Germany and India. In creative writing, Krisha Kops has won the U20 Poetry Slam Championship of Germany, Austria and Switzerland in 2005. His first novel was published in March 2022 and won the Bayerischer Kunstförderpreis 2022. And with him we have Arunava Sinha, who is a prolific translator.
Yeah, we've had his bio will just read out.
Yeah, we are looking forward to an exciting session, which is the final session also. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Hi.
Hi.
This is your 24th visit to India, 137, 59?
It depends on how many lives you count in.
All of them.
And whether physical or mental. But I can't count. I mean, I live here partially, so I...
Right, you practically live here. So, you are probably the first in a long line of philosophers from Germany who've been interested in India, who's also been a slam poet. Right? Do you know of any others who fit that category?
No, actually not. I mean, I haven't been to the seminars of some of the philosophers, but maybe, Schelling was also kind of slam philosophizing while he was in a seminar. I couldn't tell.
How delicious that would be to listen to them. But that is what I wanted to start our conversation with, not the slam poetry. Although that too, if you'd like to perform. Would you at some point?
This was my earlier life.
Oh, right.
Not in this life anymore.
Right. But yes, so you are in this long tradition. And what is different now? What are you looking at? How has the outlook changed? How has the perspective changed? Where do you place yourself in this long tradition?
See, initially, with the encounter of German thinkers with India, it was very much also about the own yearnings and the projections of the German thinkers, right? Whether you talk about, for example, the beginning of the 19th century and the Romantics, or later on the German novelists in the beginning of the 20th century. It was more about themselves, actually, than it was about India, right? For example, in the beginning of the 18th century, when all these translations came from the British occupants at that time, the Germans were looking for their own identity. Napoleon was ruling all over Europe, and there was apparently this connection between German and Sanskrit language, so they looked for their own roots to reinvent themselves. So it was really much more about themselves. And what changed now is that we have something that is called intercultural philosophy. So it's not about, one being superior than the other, or one trying to find oneself in the other, but trying to look for the what is happening in between, what is happening if we're comparing one philosophy with another, but not only comparing, what happens if this philosophy could be an impetus for our own thinking, or vice versa, and how do they overlap, and how do they influence and have influenced each other over long times and periods.
Okay. So are there some examples that you can talk to us about how what you do now is different from what happened then? You told us in general terms about the philosophers perhaps projecting themselves onto what they were getting from India. And the related question is, what do you mean by the philosophies of India? It's vast and diverse and many things.
So first of all, what I mean is, for example, taking one thought from maybe another philosophy in order to propel your own thought would be, I wrote an article about, actually it was about mediation. And when mediators talk to, for example, family mediators, because there's a conflict in the family, they really much observe what is present. And then reading Indian philosophy, I came upon the term of abhava. which is also there somehow in German philosophy, but very prominent also in the later Jnana philosophy. So it's about non-existence, or what is not there. So in the philosophy there's a question whether this could be a category for thinking, and whether the non-existence gives us knowledge about something. So I try to use Abhava in order to show that when we observe people, and when we observe a conflict, there's so many things which are not present, but because they're not present, they're so extremely present, right? I mean, a simple example, not relating to the conflict now, if somebody died just recently, you feel the presence of this person so strongly, although the person is absent. And this ambivalence of Abhava and Bhava at the same time is something that I got from Indian philosophy, and I try to apply to another situation in a German academics, environment. So that would be an example of how intercultural philosophy works. That's the one thing. And the other question was, sorry.
No, so I also wanted to know what you mean by Indian philosophy.
Yeah.
So vast and diverse.
Usually when I speak in German, I say Indian philosophies because it's very difficult. Like today, how you classify Indian philosophy is also a product of British colonialism, right? You have the Astikas and you have the Nastika. And then you have the classical 6 schools, and then you have the Nastika schools, which would be Buddhist schools, Jainistic schools, and Charvaka, so the materialists. I mean, now we could have a debate what is, or whether there's a different way of categorizing them, but mostly we try, kind of use these philosophies in a plural and call it as Indian philosophies, right? I mean, because at one point I have to start philosophizing. If my focus would only be to define what Indian philosophy is, I could do that, but that would hinder me from doing other work. And there are people who are fighting about exactly that. In the same way they're fighting about what is European philosophy, what is philosophy in general, right? But let's say it's a vast field with many schools of thought that I consider Indian philosophies in the plural.
Yeah. So, but do you broadly, you mentioned Astika, Nastika, mind you, my questions are all purely uninformed. Is this a broad kind of classification that you use?
Yeah, that's a broad classification which also came through the working of British people together, but then with Indian thinkers, right? There is a certain ambivalence, but at the same time a working together of these thinkers, what we call the pizza effect.
What's that?
Yeah, that's a sociological term, because the interesting fact about a pizza is that the pizza initially was just a plain bread with tomato. And when the pizza migrated with the Indian migrants with Italian migrants to Italy, suddenly they put toppings on top of it, right? Salami and whatsoever you have. And then it migrated back to Italy, and suddenly you have the pizza that you have today with cheese and all of these things. So it's really a process of migration. And today if you buy a pizza at Domino's in India, you get chicken tikka on top, right? It's all a cultural mix. And the same happened to the philosophy, in fact. Also the Indian philosophy that we consider so Indian today. It was kind of an Indian philosophy that was there. It was then, there was a reception also of European, American thinkers. And then the Indian thinkers, again, used some of these toppings for their own pizza, so to speak, at the end of the day. So it turned out to be quite a mixture. And the same happens also with the categorization of Indian philosophy. There are a lot of things which happened in the last 200 years which have not been like that in the previous time. Speaking about the Bhagavad Gītā, speaking about the Yoga Sutras, there have been really extreme developments because of this intercultural process, cross-cultural process that has been going on over the last decades and centuries.
So, talking of the Gita, you have written a book, and you've obviously studied it extensively, and it's also sort of a slightly low-hanging fruit for many philosophers around the world. So, what's your reading? What have you learned? What do you think about it?
See, my focus was not to write another comment. There's so many comments. Every Swami has a comment, so that's not my job. What really interests me, again speaking as an intercultural philosopher, what happened through the migration of the text. And that was very interesting to see how German thinkers, and I was focusing on the 20th century, because the 19th century has been researched quite extensively. So I, looked into what happened in Germany when people and thinkers, philosophers read the Bhagavad Gītā, and what happened at the same time with thinkers in India, and how did the context, political context, the social context, influence their reading. Because the theory is not that you just read a plain text, but there are a lot of reasons why there's so many diverse and different interpretations of the Bhagavad Gītā. For example, in Germany you have the whole context of the Third Reich, right? So there were reasons why they were interested in the Bhagavad Gītā and looked at it from their own perspective. So I was researching actually very much into the perception, the reception of the text in these cultural contexts. And then again you had the political struggle in India, which again influenced the perception of people such as Radhakrishna and Gandhi, who read the Bhagavad Gītā in a certain way because they wanted to apply it to the political context.
So would you unpack this a little bit for us? Give us the specific readings that in the two contexts you mentioned, and lead on from there into your own conclusions, if you like. It's not a commentary, you said.
See, I can give just a short example. There's one Indologist called Jakob Wilhelm Hauer. And Jakob Wilhelm Hauer was then one of the main Indologists in the Third Reich. So what he did is, he looked at certain aspects and took it in order to implement it for the ideology of the Nazis. Right? Apparently for Heinrich Himmler, he always had a Bhagavad Gītā with him, because it was his book. And if you read it in a certain way, of course you can use it. There's the story about the warriors fighting against, the Jewish or whatsoever. Then it was about, fighting for your duty, your dharma, and all these terms he tried to use in order to apply to the German ideology, And at the same time, you look at Gandhi, who just used it in the opposite way, making a pacifistic text out of it, because of reading it in a different way, in an allegorical way, right? So why did he? Because he used it also as a political instrument, right? And there were reasons for him to use it in that way. Also because of dharma, and then they focus on karma yoga. How do I act, and how I'm supposed to act without reaping the fruits of it? So there was specific context. And the question that I asked myself eventually is, but how do you read such a text? If on the one hand, somebody who creates the Holocaust and kills over 6 million Jews can read the Bhagavad Gītā in that way, and there's another person who reads it in a pacifistic way, what is the right way of reading really the Bhagavad Gītā? And so I tried to find an answer, which is not that easy, because on the one hand, I'm very much for having a hermeneutics and open hermeneutics where you have space for your own interpretation, because I don't believe, especially with the Bhagavad Gītā, there's an intention of an author and you can read the intention. Whenever we read the text, something new is being created. But nevertheless, there has to be an ethics of reading, how I call it. An ethics of reading that guides us while we're reading something. Also points as continuity and interpretation and so forth. So that was what I was looking into. What is the ethics of a certain reading? Ethics would also be that we are engaged in a debate about my interpretation. Because if I say this is the way the Bhagavad Gītā is supposed to be read, and your opinion doesn't count, it's not an ethics of interpretation. Ethics of interpretation would mean we engage in a dialogue of what the meaning could be.
So where do we stand there now? What is what you call the right way to read? And I personally am always skeptical about anything that says this is the right way to read something.
I believe that especially with a text like that, it's so difficult, that the openness for interpretation is even bigger than with other texts. Because first of all, who's the author? So difficult to say. So you can't rely, that was the intention of Yasa or whosoever. Secondly, it's a literary text, it's a spiritual text, it's a religious text, it's a philosophical text which mingles all these philosophies of Buddhism, Upanishad, Samkhya, Yoga, etc. So there are so many different philosophies mixed together. What is the meaning of that? Is there not a plurality of meaning actually in that? And in the end of the day, it seems to be a text that always, runs a little bit further away from us. then it's a text that is in a dialogue. So what is a dialogue? A dialogue, even in antique philosophy, opens up so that it gives continuity for the space outside of the text. What else? We have paradoxes, we have metaphors, so everything that opens up the space of interpretation. So I guess at the end of the day, the foremost important thing about it is not to settle down with a definite meaning, but with an openness for interpretation. I guess that's important.
Yes, so normally a text like this would be considered a literary masterpiece, because what you just described are all the qualities of a great literary text. They can be read in different ways, and they can mean anything that anyone wants them to mean, and so on. But yet we call it a religious text, a philosophical text. Why? Is it because it apparently talks about these things?
I mean,
why not just read it like a work of literature?
Because these texts, they become also cultural texts, right? A cultural text is if it kind of hovers above the normal canon of books. And these cultural texts, which come so important for an identity of a culture, then also become part of the power struggle. So there will be eventually people, but also politicians and so forth, who will instrumentalize these cultural texts because they give you the power over the identity of the culture. Having the power of interpreting or having the hegemony over the interpretation will give you automatically power in terms of defining the culture. And that's why it always undergoes the struggle of being interpreted as a religious text, as a philosophical text, as the Hindu text, or whatever way. So I guess that's one of the reasons it's such a strong cultural text that it has become over the last centuries, even more so.
So one quick question before we move on, which is, why would the Third Reich need to justify itself using the Bhagavad Gītā as a source for supporting material?
I mean, this was only one part. Obviously, it was not the only text that they used, but it came very handy because there was, since already the beginning of the 19th century, continuity when it came to terms like Aryan. They wanted to find this Aryan terms, and there were some German interpreters who actually said, it's an Aryan text, like Jakob Wilhelm Hauer said. It shows the struggle of the brothers against the brothers. That's such an Aryan theme. And in addition, there was still this thought from the beginning of the 19th century that there is a special connection with the Sanskrit and the German, and maybe the roots of the German society, of the German people, somehow lie in the Himalayas or wheresoever. They had expeditions, as you know, trying to find these roots, because there were parts of the movement who tried to separate from the Jewish Christian history, right? Because the Abrahamic religions were much stronger connected, so the Jewish was closer to the Christians, so some of them tried to find a different lineage and a different way in order to explain the German special identity. And therefore, texts like the Bhagavad Gītā became quite handy. At the same time, also the ancient Greek, right? These were two of the ancient civilizations they looked into in order to found or create a fundament for their own alleged special German identity.
Okay, this we could just talk about this alone for a long time. But I really do you want to give us a reading from from what you've written on this subject, or do you want to read something else?
If you want to, otherwise.
Or maybe we can pick something else as the conversation goes
Okay.
on. Or we'll come back to this.
Yeah.
We can leave it to people, or we can come back to it. So one of the things that's very intriguing about your website is where you would say that you are an everyday philosopher. Or is that the right term?
I don't know what's
But
right.
is there-
I don't know.
is-
Actually, philosophers initially, or even if you look, Indian society, but if you look at the ancient Greek society and the Hellenistic society, they were always street philosophers. They weren't in a university and you couldn't touch them, and they talked with all these difficult terms and nobody understood. So what they did is, at least in the text that we know from Socrates and so forth, they were having dialogues with other citizens and people. Thank you very much. And they were very much part also of society. And that's what I define, as everyday philosopher. It means not only to live in this far away place above everyone else and having this abstract thoughts, but actually using these thoughts which are so important for society and try to bring them into a discussion, into a discourse with everyone around him or her.
So two questions that arise. One, what are some of these things? And two, how do you do that, more importantly? I mean, you can't be a bard on the street corner trying to attract people, or maybe you can.
You can. You know that what Karl Marx did in England at that time. So they had the corner speakers. So what Karl Marx did, he stood there and he was basically also philosophizing. He's a trained philosopher, right? Not only an economist. So you can do it. And there are, like, one of these things is where you go with the box and you have different questions and you go to people on the streets and you discuss with them. And I think that's one important thing to do. Also, Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, that's what he used to do. He went to the street and just spoke to people. Because I think one of the main issues nowadays is that we have a society with intellectuals but also politicians who think, you know, there are many people who are too dumb, so we don't speak to them. But actually people are not too dumb. It's more that people do not engage in proper dialogues. It's very interesting. Everybody in a certain way is a philosopher or philosophizes at all times. These are fundamental questions that concern everybody, everywhere, at all times. And it's only about making the endeavor of also getting into this dialogue and speaking with each other. So that would be one thing, but there's so many other things that you could do. It's, for example, we have philosophical voyages, you know, travels, where we go with groups to certain places, like, for example, in ancient Greek, and then we talk about the philosophy, but we visit the places as well. Maybe we have some of the ancient activities. That's one of the things you can do. And they are actually something like...
What are these ancient activities, for example?
Like the classical symposium. I don't know if you've maybe read the Symposium by Plato. So you drink a lot of red wine, and then you have this round of people who drink red wine. Maybe it's a little bit like here in Bengal, and everyone, somebody, the youngest usually, chooses the topic, and there's someone who can choose also the mixture between water and red wine because it used to be stronger, and then the round goes basically almost like a mic, and everybody can speak to the topic that has been chosen, and everybody has a short speech. And the youngest person who chose the topic can then say whether it was a good speech or a bad speech. So the same thing that happens in the Symposium of Socrates, where they speak about eros, about love. And that's one of the activities that you can do as well. Yeah.
Have you considered doing that in India with the Bhagavad Gītā, for example?
No, what I did, not in the same way without the wine, what happened, for example, in Krishnamurti Foundation in Varanasi, where I was 4 years ago. So they have also a circle, a dialogue circle, which not functions exactly in the same way, but they also have a dialogue which tries to delve deep into a topic, not by, you know, having arguments against each other, by asking a question, and then together by asking even deeper question concerning this question, going deeper and deeper to the fundament of really what this question is about, and then, you know, to delve to the roots of it basically, but together, without discussing, you know, having opinions about it. So it's a way that exists also in India, and there are many ways, you know. They're just different forms of it all around the world. But these philosophical exercises you find everywhere.
I imagine that social media would be a great place to get something like this going now. Have you thought about it?
Yeah, I have colleagues who do this.
You have a very exciting Instagram profile.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, I have colleagues who are really strong on Instagram, but it takes a lot of time. And if you really don't have someone who does it for you, you need a lot of passion doing it. And honestly, I like doing other things as well. So I like if somebody posts something, I can repost it, not that much work. But really, you know, I mean, it's a science by itself. So, and the question is also, you reach indeed some people, but at the end of the day, for me, philosophy is also more than that. It's about, it's an encounter which may start online, but which ideally goes into a physical space, you know, because philosophy for a long time has neglected also the physical space, the physical aspects, the embodiment of philosophy. So I prefer sitting here with you and speaking in an environment with other people instead of just being online all the time.
Okay. And we were talking earlier, and you were talking about some of the things, practices that you brought into your. So maybe you want to read us.
Yeah, I may. Yeah, let me read something, and then we can maybe continue on that one. See, one thing is what has been part of philosophy for a very long time, which still is part of maybe many Asian philosophies, not so much of the European philosophies, are philosophical exercises. So that's one of the things I'm really interested in, and that I also practice myself partly, and I talk about with other people and try to advise them to do if they want to. So this is from an article I wrote some years back, a short excerpt. It's called Take Care of Yourself, Exercises in Philosophical Art of Living. The concern for oneself, epimelia hiato, as it was called by the ancient Greeks, was the concern of philosophy for a long time. And those who take care of themselves must work on themselves with the help of exercises. The gaze is being directed inwards in order to attain the truth that lies within us, albeit on a different level of being. In many schools of thought, through rites, meditation and spiritual exercises, one tries to recognize one's true being or respectively non-being. Meditation. One of the main exercises in antiquity is melete, called meditatio by the Romans. This meditation has nothing to do with controlling thoughts. Rather, it is a contemplation, a thought exercise in which we remember what is good and true so that we have it at hand when it is needed. Often we speak aloud to ourselves in order to anchor the thought even more firmly in our consciousness. That could be, for example, small aphorisms of your, maybe even your favorite novel. For example, in the morning we think about what we want to do during the day. In the evening, on the other hand, one contemplates what one has accomplished during the day. Epictetus reflects on what things were going on, how they affected him, how he depended on them, and how he behaved towards them. A similar exercise is premeditatio malorum. Here one imagines a future misfortune that will happen soon. The point is to test oneself in order to see if one is prepared for evil. This takes the element of surprise out of the calamity. It is an armor against the world. Another type of meditation is the melete thanatao. One meditates on death. You find it like in every philosophy I encounter, that there's some meditation on death. Even puts oneself in the place of a dying person, thus giving life the right weight. In this way, the most important thing, the present, becomes the focus. Besides this, carpe diem, thinking about death, helps us to objectify our view of things. We look back on our whole life, not from down here, but impartially with a view from above. One must learn to die throughout one's life, are Seneca's famous words on the subject. Observing, another exercise that you find in different philosophies. Also Krishnamurti that I mentioned, for example. Observing nature is also an exercise. On the one hand, it allows us to recognize how we are in relation to the things around us. On the other hand, as the Epicureans say, it equips us, makes us brave and strong against the superstition that people want to impose on us. We are no longer surprised by the nature, since we are familiar with it, have learned its laws through observation. But observing is anything but easy, if we may believe the Indian thinker Jiddu Krishnamurti, because we rarely just look at something. Most of the time our prejudices, our fears, our ego gets in the way. Some thinkers of antiquity go even further in their contemplation of nature. It is recommended to imagine the universe in its infinity, in all its temporal and spatial expanse. Over millennia later, the Dutch philosopher Baruch de Spinoza also gazes up at the heavenly stars. He suggests that in moments of frustration, one should look at the cosmos, look at everything from the point of view
of eternity, sub specie aeternitatis. Then we could shed new light on our situation, on its actual unimportance and our nothingness. It is the contemporary thinker Alain de Botton who takes this idea even further by suggesting that the best thing to do is to show the universe after the television news, so that in silence we can become aware of the billions of galaxies, the septillions of stars. When we work on ourselves, we must never forget the moral aspects. In antiquity, as in Eastern philosophies, concern for oneself does not stop with oneself. One works on oneself in order to approach other people morally, even to take care of them. Self-care also has nothing to do with the self-optimization of modernity. Pedometer and calorie counter app are not the instruments of exercise, at least not the philosophical kind. Neither is it about producing more, nor about functioning better. No, it's about one's own and consequentially everyone's well-being. So there are many more exercises, hearing, talking, dialogues, breathing. So these are just a few exercises.
Yes, thank you for that. And as usual, we could have gone on. But I want you to talk about your novel. Will you tell us about it? What made you write fiction?
It was a philosophical exercise.
Of course.
No, writing is indeed, writing is very much a philosophical exercise as well.
Can you unpack that?
No, I mean, it was not only a philosophical exercise. And people call it a philosophical novel, but at the end of the day, I didn't write it in order to make it a philosophical novel. As I am working as a philosopher, obviously it had to be philosophical because it's a part of myself, but nevertheless I'm not a person who's writing a discourse novel and who writes about, utilitarianism and then other philosophical ideas. For me, literature is rather the other side. Whilst philosophy is rather the rational part of me, literature is more the emotional part of me. Of course, only in parts. And they both have different functions of how to approach truth. So, philosophy has a way of propositional knowledge. Through arguments, we try to find a proof or know something. And literature has this beautiful way of non-propositional knowledge. Not by arguments, but by other instruments and ways they find their way towards knowledge and truth. And therefore I thought it's very beautiful for me to have both of these instruments in order to go this way towards an alleged truth. And therefore I think writing was always a part of me.
Alright, but since your novel's in German, and we're not going to be able to read it
Not yet.
soon. Not yet. Tell us a little bit about it, please.
The novel is a family novel of 4 generations expanding over India and Germany. And it is narrated by a banyan tree. But not only by a banyan tree, but also by 2 winds who help the banyan tree to narrate this story.
Okay, you're not going to obviously tell us more. I can see.
No,
There's a very finality about that.
No, you have to buy it. I can't tell you, otherwise people won't buy it. No, it's about the tragedies, it's a lot about migration, it's about love, it's about people finding together, the difficulties of cultural encounter, and also, it's in the end, essentially it's also about home, because of migration, it's about the metaphor that the banyan tree gives us, falling, finding roots in the air, growing aerial roots, connecting to the ground, growing out of the ground another trunk, around another trunk, growing other trunks. So that's the metaphor behind it, and that's what the novel is about. It's about home. Where do I find home? Horizontally, on earth, and vertically, in the spiritual dimension.
Okay.
That was enough?
You'll make a good blurb writer for your own novel. So, when you say, and you have actually said it in as many words, you say, I'm a philosopher. Now, these are words that also have certain positions in today's socio-political, economic. So we know that a scientist is supposed to research and discover, invent things. We know that well, no one knows what a mathematician does. We know that a writer is supposed to produce books. We know that an engineer, a doctor, a judge, an MBA, etc. So, what is a philosopher supposed to do? What does a philosopher do other than think and write? Is there anything more to it? Is there something about the existence of a philosopher? Maybe that's what I'm interested in. And in the same context, I want to know how you grew up to be one. What is the childhood of a philosopher like?
I mean, it's a very difficult question. You know, in Germany, people wouldn't call themselves philosophers because there's only one philosopher, maybe Immanuel Kant, and after that no one is allowed to call themselves a philosopher, but maybe people who philosophize. Whilst you go to France, everyone is a philosopher, even a psychologist who talks about, you know, comments on society and political ongoings. So, of course, it's a question, it's a moot question. What is a philosopher in terms of... And, you know, it's just people like labels, and therefore I accept the label. At the end of the day, you as a creative writing teacher, when I was writing, and I was writing quite extensively, very passionately, it was difficult for me to call myself a writer because at some point I have not had published a book. So the question was for me, am I a writer? So how do I define whether I'm a writer? Am I a writer because I've published a book? Or am I a writer because it's part of my DNA and it's one of the things that I'm most passionate about and I do it nevertheless? For me it's the latter, right? It's the latter. And in the same way, I guess it's for me also as a philosopher, was someone who practitioners as a philosopher. It's something I'm very ardent, I'm very passionate about, something I do, and at the end of the day, whether I become a professor at the university or not is of less relevance.